You gotta send the program.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's our pleasure and privilege today to bring you remarks by Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization. The Peterson Institute has been proud to be involved with the WTO, its predecessor, and its ongoing function in the world economy for years. And we're very proud to welcome the first woman Director General and a longtime public servant in Dr. Ngozi. We hope today she will set out the case, as I know she is willing to do, on the benefits of the multilateral trading system to the global economy in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and addressing current developments in world trade, including WTO reform possibilities ahead of the upcoming ministerial. We're very honored to have Dr. Ngozi with us today. I will just mention that I'm making her a gift of our newest publication, Making the Most of the 2021 WTO Ministerial, including contributions by Chad Bown, Tom Boyke, Jeff Schott, and former Deputy Director General Alan Wolf. I make this as a gift not because she needs more reading, but because we intend this to help the U.S. find a way back to being a constructive player in the ministerial that is coming up for the WTO. Just briefly and insufficiently to introduce Dr. Ngozi, she is the 7th Director General of the World Trade Organization and took office earlier this year in March. She is the first woman and the first African to serve as Director General. She recently was appointed as African Union Special Envoy to mobilize international financial support for the fight against COVID-19 and WHO Special Envoy for Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. This understates her role. She also served on the high-level Commission on Pandemic Financing and has been a leading voice in asking the world to come together to deal with the grips of the pandemic. Previously, Dr. Ngozi served twice as Nigeria's finance minister between 2003 to 2006 and 2011 to 2015. She also had a 25-year career at the World Bank as a development economist, rising to the #2 position of managing director for operations. Again, I admire the public service and the global reach of our speaker today, and I'd like to welcome to the Peterson Institute stage, Dr. Ngozi.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Adam, for that introduction, and it's wonderful to be at the Peterson Institute. I first have to thank you for kindly lending us Annabel Gonzalez, my Deputy Director General, one of the best in trade. It's good to be here with you. It's always a pleasure to be back. And the Peterson Institute continues to do top-notch work on trade, from hardcore number crunching to analysis of the COVID-19 response and big picture thinking about the global economy. And of course, the Peterson Institute is home to that original trade policy podcast that Annabel used to host. I referred to her earlier. So today, I'd really like to focus my remarks, as you indicated, on the importance of the multilateral trading system and the WTO to present and future global challenges. Let's think back to March and April of last year. Over half of the global population was under some kind of lockdown measure. Trade went into the steepest decline on record, with merchandise trade volumes shrinking 15% year on year and services trade values falling 30% in the second quarter of 2020. During the early weeks of the pandemic, when personal protective equipment and other medical countermeasures were suddenly in desperately short supply, many blamed the shortages on import dependence rather than the unforeseen spike in demand. Several governments restricted exports of key goods in an attempt to shore up domestic availability. At the time, only the bravest of gamblers would have bet that global merchandise trade would be breaking new records by the first quarter of 2021. But that's exactly what has happened. Fiscal and monetary stimulus supported demand. Broad restraint in the use of trade protective measures meant that supply chains were mostly able to resume operations when lockdown eased. I know that with the present snafu with supply chains, people will find that difficult to believe, but believe me, supply chains did really contribute to operations and trade when the lockdowns eased. Trade rebounded strongly starting in the second half of 2020. Governments removed many, though not all, of the initial export restrictions. New measures to facilitate the movement of goods and services covered a higher value of trade than new restrictions. Trade became a lifeline for access to food and medical products and a driver of economic recovery. The picture is far from perfect. I'll come back to vaccine inequity, persistent bottlenecks, and economic divergence that is leaving so many people behind. Nevertheless, whilst the pandemic is far from over, merchandise trade is at historical highs, despite health-related restrictions on travel and transport. The big stories in global trade right now are not about a great trade collapse, but about port congestion, high freight costs, snarled supply chains, and suppliers trying but failing to keep up with resurgent demand. For trade and for the trading system, which has taken some hits in the past few years, this is a major success and a success worth building on. I want to use my remarks today to do three things, and excuse me if I take a little bit of time to do it in the next 25 minutes or so, because I think these things matter. First, I want to look at the benefits the multilateral trading system continues to provide to the global economy. Second, I will talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and current developments in world trade. And finally, I'll share some thoughts on the future of trade and why it is important to reform the WTO so that it can keep delivering on its founding mandate to improve people's lives by creating jobs, raising living standards, and fostering sustainability. I will also tell you about a few things already happening at the WTO that go in the right direction and explain why our upcoming 12th Ministerial Conference, which begins at the end of next month, is pivotal for the WTO's future. So let's get started. First, the WTO and the current trade landscape. Perceptions that trade on a multilateral basis is in decline are understandable. Recent years have witnessed a bruising trade war and growing talk of decoupling among leading economies. The WTO's own struggles to negotiate multilateral agreements have not helped. Neither has the paralysis of the appeal stage of our dispute settlement system. And yet, to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of the deaths of multilateral trade are greatly exaggerated. Warnings of de-globalization are not matched by the evidence, not yet at least. There are as yet few visible signs of net reshoring of supply chain activity or falling trade in intermediate goods. It is true that the ratio of merchandise trade to global GDP peaked around the global financial crisis of 2008. But this is understandable given the boost to trade from market reforms and global integration of China, India, and the former Soviet bloc, which is now a generation in the rearview mirror. The denominator global GDP has grown considerably over that time. Despite intensifying political pressures for decoupling, business and household decisions have propelled merchandise trade between the European Union and China to record highs, while US-China trade is on track to follow suit later this year. On trade as on climate change and other problems of the global commons, people and companies need the three big economic powers to pursue strategic cooperation alongside strategic competition. Multilateral bodies like the WTO offer a venue for them to engage in the former whilst managing frictions arising from the latter. The overwhelming majority of global merchandise trade continues to operate on basic WTO terms, the tariff levels that governments apply on a non-discriminatory basis to all WTO members, in line with our core most favored nation or MFN principle. The preferential tariffs arising from the growing number of bilateral and regional trade agreements have a smaller footprint in global commerce than you might expect. If we count the European Union as one economy, over 75% of global merchandise trade continues to operate on MFN terms. All other regional trade arrangements together account for about 20%. The remainder is subject to tariffs levied on a non-MFN basis, including unilateral measures. There are two reasons for the large MFN share. First, the world's biggest economies mostly do not have free trade agreements with each other. Trade among the US, China, and the EU operates on terms defined at the WTO. Second, decades of multilateral and autonomous trade liberalization by governments have brought tariffs to zero on about half of global merchandise trade. This duty-free access extends to all WTO members, not just to bilateral and regional partners. In Geneva, WTO committees continue to provide a forum for members to examine each other's policies and nip potential trade disputes in the bud. For instance, members notify thousands of new health and safety standards and product regulations each year. The share singled out for specific trade concerns is low, but the number is growing steadily, 93 last year, with the upward trend continuing in 2021. Going back to 1995, less than 2% of the 1,200-odd concerns raised about standards and regulations have ended up in dispute settlement. This points to the value of the committee process at resolving potential tensions. That said, there is considerable scope to improve notification practices, and there are areas such as subsidies, digital economic policies, and the new carbon-related measures where many members feel that existing rules leave committees ill-equipped to address contemporary concerns. With regard to dispute settlement, first-tier panels continue to issue rulings. Since the appellate body went into the deep freeze in December 2019, the number of formal disputes initiated by members has declined from the earlier baseline. We have 5 in 2020, 8 so far this year in 2021, although this might have something to do with the pandemic. The WTO provides alternative paths to address disputes as well, and I'm excited to say a member has recently approached me about using the mediation powers given to the Director General to attempt to resolve a dispute. At the same time, any rules-based system needs effective dispute settlement, and we need to find a way forward on restoring WTO dispute settlement to full functionality. I hope we can begin the dialogue on the process towards this and agree a timeline for delivery at MC12. COVID-19 trade and the WTO. COVID-19 trade and the WTO. Turning now to the COVID-19 pandemic. The WTO system has, at least thus far, helped the global economy weather its second biggest stress test in the space of 13 years. As I said at the outset, trade has been a force for good in the pandemic. The multilateral trading system helped keep goods and services circulating, allowing supply chains to work and people to access food and medical supplies even through lockdowns. In 2020, even as the value of global merchandise trade fell by 6.7%, the values of trade in medical products rose by 16%. Trade in personal protective equipment grew by nearly 50% and by 480% for textile face masks. Later in the year, as scientists developed and tested COVID-19 vaccines at record speed, supply chains cutting across a dozen or more countries came together to provide the specialized inputs and capital goods needed for vaccine production at scale. Peterson Institute researchers like Chad Bone have done excellent work to document this process. The 6.5 billion doses the world has produced of vaccines may not be nearly enough to meet our needs, but we could not have gotten even this far with purely national supply chains. The stark inequity in the distribution of those billions of vaccine doses is a major factor in the divergent trends we now see in global trade and economic output. Last week, we issued our latest trade forecast. The good news is that merchandise trade is growing even faster than expected. Our economists now see trade volumes growing by 10.8% in 2021, nearly 3 percentage points higher than their projection in March. In 2022, merchandise trade should grow at 4.7%. The bad news is divergence across regions. This mirrors the K-shaped recovery we have been seeing in global economic output, where places with ready vaccine access and a lot of fiscal firepower, which means advanced and some emerging economies, have been recovering strongly, while poorer regions lag behind. It's so interesting, coming from the meeting of the IMFC, the International Monetary Fund Committee, that this issue of divergent paths in output growth is what was on the table, mirroring what we are finding in trade. The divergent trajectories are more apparent, projected over a multi-year period. Our trade forecast estimates that between the pre-pandemic year of 2019 and the final quarter of 2022, Asia's exports will have grown by 18.8%, and North America's and Europe's by around 8%, compared to 4.8% for South America, 2.9% for the Middle East, and 1.9% for Africa. The IMF estimates that global GDP will grow by 5.9% this year compared to, for example, 3.7% for Sub-Saharan Africa. This week, it downgraded its growth forecast for low-income developing countries by 0.6 percentage points to 3.3%. It is not coincidental that only 4.8% of Africans and 1.6% of people in low-income countries are fully vaccinated, compared to over 70% in the European Union and 57% in the US. Frontline workers are dying, even though the means to save them, the technology, exists. From his jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, Martin Luther King wrote, and I quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," unquote, and that we are all connected in an, quote, "inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." Dr. King was talking about conscience and moral responsibility, but his memorable image applies very literally when we confront the injustice of vaccine inequity. The current inequality in access to COVID-19 vaccines is morally unacceptable, but it is also a practical and economic threat to people everywhere, even in countries that thought they had put the pandemic behind them. The longer the virus circulates freely in parts of the world, the likelier that dangerous new variants will emerge and go global. Our mutuality is inescapable. Weaker than expected jobs numbers in the US in August and September suggest that the highly transmissible Delta variant might be weighing on the economic recovery here. Before I took office at the WTO this past March, I knew a thing or two about vaccine production and deployment, having served as the chair of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, for 5 years. It was clear to me that trade had an important role to play in ending the global COVID-19 vaccine shortage and in rekindling global growth. We cannot get the vaccine production and deployment we need without cooperative action on trade in inputs and final products. And we will only have a sustained and inclusive recovery in trade and the wider economy when we get our vaccine policy right. As I always say, and in short, trade policy is vaccine policy, and vaccine policy is trade policy. At the WTO, we have been focusing on supply chain issues since obstacles to the smooth operation of supply chains can hold back vaccine production and distribution and deter much needed investment. The Secretariat of the WTO has been monitoring export restrictions and trade facilitating measures. I joined a task force with my counterparts from the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to mobilize financing and action on non-financial constraints for vaccine access. As part of WTO's contribution, we have worked directly with vaccine manufacturers to identify and address supply chain bottlenecks and encourage investment in increased production, particularly in emerging markets and developing countries. The current crisis has made clear that the pre-pandemic status quo, in which the world relied on 10 countries or 80% of vaccine exports, is not resilient in a crisis. We need to diversify and decentralize the manufacturing of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, but also ensure that they can rely on open, smoothly functioning supply chains. Our efforts and quiet behind-the-scenes diplomacy have begun to bear fruit. The number of pandemic-related export restrictions and prohibitions has come down from 116 at the beginning of the pandemic to about 50. One problem that came to light earlier this year was that standard trade data, the HS 6-digit level for the tariff nerds, was not granular enough to capture what was happening with vaccine inputs and raw materials, which would get lumped in with other products. The WTO Secretariat has worked with other international organizations and manufacturers themselves to identify the key vaccine inputs and raw materials, as well as trade policy and regulatory bottlenecks that can impede their movement around the world. You can read the resulting papers on our website. They describe regulatory obstacles and capacity limitations that could slow down vaccine distribution and discourage production partnerships, and point to ways to improve. For example, recognizing vaccines granted World Health Organization emergency use listing could save time on standard national regulatory processes. Many vaccines from the same factory batch get retested in multiple countries, putting doses weeks closer to expiration by the time they are released. Tariffs on critical vaccine-related inputs remain surprisingly high in many WTO members that manufacture vaccines, generally more so in developing countries, with average tariffs ranging from 1.5% to as much as nearly 12%. Bioreactor bags needed for vaccine production face tariffs averaging around 6%. Reducing these tariffs would help lower vaccine manufacturing costs and encourage supply chain investment. On the diplomatic side of things, several members have put forward proposals related to trade and health, or response to the pandemic, as we call it at the WTO, aimed at ensuring that key products are available and equitably accessible in this and future crises. The goal is to turn all of this work into a strong ministerial declaration on trade and health by MC12. Negotiators in Geneva have showed convergence on the importance of keeping supply chains open, dealing with export restrictions, trade facilitation, bottlenecks, and so on. The idea of strengthened cooperation with other international organizations to encourage more decentralized manufacturing capacity has also gained traction. But on the third element of an informal TRIPS waiver proposal, the formal negotiations are stuck. Though informal consultations continue and are intensifying. Following this week's productive meeting of G20 trade ministers in Sorrento and their resolve to make progress on these issues of response to the pandemic, I believe that members can find a pragmatic compromise on the IP waiver, which ensures equitable access to developing countries whilst preserving incentives for research and innovation. Vaccine equity is a prerequisite for the currently bifurcated economic trajectories to converge upwards, but it is not sufficient. Trade and predictably open international markets have a wider role here too, because they are macro-critical, important for a strong, sustained recovery for rich and poor countries alike. Poor countries need access to bigger markets and innovation, inputs and capital to grow rapidly. Trade also matters for advanced economies at the technological frontier because it enables greater specialization, scale, competition, and by extension productivity, which is key to raising living standards, people's living standards. Closing off trade would add to stagflationary pressures, raising prices for goods and services without raising productivity. This brings me to my final theme, things the WTO can do better. For all of the important successes I described earlier, the fact remains that commercial realities are changing. The world is changing fast. The WTO rulebook needs to evolve to continue to play its historical role of providing security and predictability to cross-border economic exchange. For example, digital and services trade are increasingly important, but WTO rules do not provide the same degree of precision in these areas as they do for merchandise trade. In addition, some of the biggest threats to people's living standards and security now come from global commons problems like climate change and ocean health, and of course the pandemic, as we've already discussed. We must consciously use trade and the WTO to help tackle these problems. Finally, globalization has left many people behind, poor countries and poor people in rich countries, while technological change is often the real culprit, and many solutions are in the realm of domestic social policy, especially active labor market policies. We can do more to make trade a vehicle for socioeconomic inclusion. The good news is that WTO members are already engaged on all of these fronts, services and digital, and making trade greener and more inclusive. In some of these processes, members can deliver results by or through MC12 and beyond. Services now account for the bulk of global output and employment. Efficient services are crucial for the competitiveness of industrial and agricultural production as well. Between 2010 and 2019, global exports of commercial services grew by 57% compared to 25% growth for merchandise trade. In this regard, it is welcome that 66 members, including the United States, are close to finalizing an agreement on domestic regulation that will set out shared parameters for government licensing and other qualification requirements for services providers. This promises to lower costs and enhance predictability for businesses in the sector. Digital commerce has become increasingly central to business activity and trade, and cross-border data flows have boomed despite a growing array of national rules and restrictions. The pandemic pushed businesses and consumers online around the world, as demonstrated by booming payment values for e-commerce firms from Amazon here to Mercado Libre in Latin America, Jumia in Africa, and Flipkart in India. 86 WTO members, including the United States, China, and the EU, are engaged in plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce. These offer the prospect of shared global standards on issues such as electronic contracts, payments, and spam, and predictable terms of engagement on more contentious issues around data governance. While several poor countries are already part of these negotiations, investments in bridging the digital divide and enhancing regulatory capacity would give more of them confidence to join the talks and help shape international rules in this area. A key test of WTO members' collective willingness to help address global commons problems will come between now and MC12. Concluding an agreement after 20 years to curb the tens of billions of dollars in annual subsidies that encourage overfishing would make a material difference for ocean health and biodiversity. It would help the long-term livelihoods of millions of fisherwomen and men, and it would demonstrate that WTO members can still negotiate multilaterally. Another global commons problem where the trading system can play an important role is climate change. Trade can help make it cheaper to decarbonize our economies and get more value for each dollar of green investment. Lowering trade barriers to environmental goods and services would reduce the cost of decarbonization. Carbon pricing is surely part of the mix of policies needed to fight climate change. But the proliferation of varying carbon prices and methodologies with proposals for unilateral border adjustments seems likely to become contentious in trade relations as well as in debates over climate justice. Fragmentation and uncertainty would be costly for businesses and potentially ineffective for spurring the low-carbon transition we need. As we approach COP26, I have proposed that the OECD, the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank should work together on a common methodological approach that would include all voices and help avoid trade wars or cycles of litigation. Groups of WTO members in Geneva are looking at a range of climate-related issues as well as plastics pollution, though these initiatives are fairly new. On socioeconomic inclusion, large numbers of WTO members are working to expand opportunities in regional and global markets for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises and women-owned businesses. This would extend the benefits of trade across more people because SMEs account for 95% of businesses and about 60% of the global labor force, but are underrepresented in cross-border trade. Agencies affiliated with the WTO, i.e. the International Trade Center, the Enhanced Integrated Framework, and the Standards and Trade Development Facility, are all engaged in supply-side work to help small businesses upgrade the quality of their goods and services and break into international value chains. A related issue is what I like to call re-globalization. This is about integrating poor countries more fully into global trade and supply chains. We have in recent years seen less established locations like Vietnam, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Turkey, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia attract investment oriented towards international supply chains. We need more of this to bring hitherto poorly integrated parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America into the global economic mainstream. This would yield substantial dividends in terms of growth and development. It might even give a boost to the global trade to GDP ratio. Some of these initiatives I mentioned are multilateral, and others are plurilateral, though open to all WTO members. This is in line with the long-standing role within the GATT WTO system for different instruments and flexible formats, best exemplified by the Information Technology Agreement. That plurilateral agreement eliminates tariffs on a set of high-tech products among a group of 82 members, accounting for more than 97% of the more than $1.8 trillion in annual global trade in those goods. Before closing, I want to look more narrowly at our upcoming ministerial. All of the WTO's three core functions, negotiations, monitoring and implementation, and dispute settlement, are essential for a balanced and future-proof institution. All are at stake at MC12 and beyond. And I'm very happy to also note that the USTR Ambassador Catherine Tai in Geneva today made a speech strongly supporting the need for the WTO to reform and to assume its role in supporting the multilateral trading system. To increase their chances of success at the ministerial, I have urged members to concentrate on delivering results in 2 or 3 focused areas and then set out progress and future work programs for other priorities. Let's remember, as one trade minister said, quote, "There is life after MC12. For a successful MC12, we need a set of outcomes, an outcome driven to completing negotiation and agreement in 1 or 2 key areas, e.g., response to the pandemic or trade and health, fisheries subsidies, domestic regulation of services, along with some basic agreements in agriculture. Added to this would be agreement on a process for reforming and revitalizing the dispute settlement function post-MC12. Progress on other important areas such as e-commerce, investment facilitation, climate change and trade, SMEs and women would be part of this success. Success at MC12 would reinvigorate the WTO and give members new momentum to tackle other concerns on their agendas, from agricultural and industrial subsidies to strengthening the WTO's notification and transparency function. We must not forget issues that are development related, addressing concerns about special and differential treatment for developing countries and issues related to the least developed countries and their concerns. In a deeply interdependent world with an increasingly multipolar distribution of economic power, we are all safer and better off when all countries can come to a common table to manage frictions over trade and the cross-border spillover effects of each other's economic policies. There are also issues such as those pertaining to subsidies or global commons problems that can only be effectively addressed multilaterally. That is why the WTO remains vital. That is why we need the multilateral trading system. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's reform the WTO we have and make it work better for people and the planet everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Director General. We invite you back up on our stage. In compliance with our lawyer's interpretation of local customs, I will put on the mask.
So will I.
Very kind of you. I do not wish to distract. You gave a magisterial speech in scope, reflecting the agenda and the breadth of your commitments. We're very proud that our colleague Ana Gonzalez is part of your leadership team, and I know that she joined you because of this emphasis on trade as benefit for all, including for countries. Can we start just briefly by talking about the fisheries discussion? Because this is one that in the US or Europe doesn't get the attention it deserves. What? Doesn't get the attention which it deserves. So could you say a few more words about why you are hopeful to get a fisheries deal and why it is important rather than just a special interest issue?
Well, Adam, we are here talking about issues of the global commons, and surely the idea of ocean health and sustainability, actually, the WTO was asked to deliver the negotiations of harmful fisheries subsidies as part as SDG 14.6. Yes. We are talking of two things. It's terribly important because of livelihoods of fisherwomen and men also. In 1970, estimates that were that 10% of global fish stocks were overfished. Around this time now, it's about 34% that is overfished, 1/3. If we keep waiting before getting an agreement, we might find 50, 60% overfished. This is very significantly not good. So for reasons of livelihoods for poor fisherwomen and men, and for all of us, ocean health, biodiversity of our oceans, and sustainability, it's important for ordinary people that we not spend even one more year trying to negotiate this. It's been 21 years. If we're really serious about sustainability, we need to get to grips and complete these negotiations. This is also the one of two multilateral negotiations going on. One is this fisheries subsidies, the other is agriculture, that have been going on for years. If we could complete this, it would also demonstrate the ability of WTO members to actually complete a multilateral negotiations, and I think that that would be a good thing. I'm hopeful that we can do it. I must be clear that there are still significant differences among members on issues of special and differential treatment, for instance, and how extensive that will be, on how biting the disciplines are on the big subsidizers, issues of fishing in the high seas. So there are a number of issues that are still very difficult, but I think that with hard work, really, we can do it. The trade ministers in Sorrento, I just came from the G20 trade ministers meeting, were very supportive that we should make all efforts to get this done.
Thank you for stating the case so clearly for our audience. May I turn to, of course, what has been the core issue of the moment and the future, which is trade and health in dealing with pandemics. And in my introduction to you earlier, I did not give due recognition of your leadership at Gavi. So building on that, you've been at the World Bank, you've been with Gavi, you're now with WTO. How goes the united front, or the lack of united front, in addressing the pandemic issue? And you made very powerful reference to the divergence of vaccine availability, of health availability, translating into economic divergence. What can the ministerial or a work program started at the ministerial do to close that gap?
Thank you, Adam. For me, this issue of health as part of the response to the pandemic and what trade can do is really vital. I think that, the trade and the WTO can be part of the solution to this problem. And at the ministerial, we have to demonstrate it with some outcome, be it a strong ministerial declaration that identifies what we can do now for this pandemic, but also sets us up for the future. I think the inequity in access to vaccines I referred to in my speech is a moral, practical, and economic problem that we need to address. So what can we do? We can certainly look at what is happening with export restrictions and prohibitions that impinge on supply chains. And I'm happy to say the Ottawa Group, at the WTO, the US, the UK, Brazil, Chinese Taipei, and others have suggested different ways and measures that we could take on trade facilitation, on export restrictions, what we could do to make sure that these are lowered as much as possible. Trade facilitation is upped, and that we can help supply chains move. So that's one cluster of issues. I have to say, I'm very proud of the work that the Secretariat staff are doing at the moment with vaccine manufacturers. I mentioned it in my speech. Again, we reached out to them, and we're working with them directly on their supply chain bottlenecks. And because we feel that if we can help them solve these and up production, scale up, help them identify where to invest in emerging markets and developing countries to increase resilience, this is a good thing. Now we can capture that work as part of what we declare at MC12. How do we work on supply chain issues to actually make them real? A third aspect that I would want to talk about is the IP waiver. As you know, the discussions on this have been going on for some time. Over 100 developing countries are proponents of the waiver, of the TRIPS waiver. Formal negotiations are stuck, but again, at the Sorrento meeting just a few days ago, there seemed to be a will to find a compromise between proponents and non-proponents that would be practical in allowing developing countries to have easier access to vaccines, whilst at the same time meeting the concerns of developed countries that research and innovation not be disincentivized. That solution is within reach. So if we could capture that, that would be the third area. Now, Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand has been appointed by the General Council Chair, Ambassador Dacio Castillo of Honduras, to try to put together all these elements so that we can have a strong ministerial declaration that ministers can sign on to. Now, if we agree on all this and we set the stage so that the next pandemic, we know what to do, we don't have to debate this, and I think that would be a very good outcome.
Thank you. As you kindly mentioned, but justifiably in your speech, our Peterson colleague Chad Bown and his co-author Tom Boyke have been doing some leading work on this that feeds into what the WTO is, and I would again just plug our making the most of the 2021 WTO ministerial. Which
Fantastic work.
Well, but it's in line with your walking the walk, which is what we care about. Let me turn, while you're here in Washington, having just come from Sorrento and Geneva, Ambassador Tai was in Geneva this morning and giving her version of a speech. At one point in her speech, she said, we need to look beyond simple dichotomies like liberalization versus protectionism or developed versus developing. Let's create shared solutions that increase economic security. Now, this is nice rhetoric. I will not presume to interpret it too much, nor ask you to do so. But in your view, what besides trade liberalization is what the WTO should be doing? What sorts of shared solutions might the WTO offer to address when U.S. officials, whether Lighthizer or Tai, talk about economic security for the middle class? Or are they just getting it wrong?
Well, first of all, let me say a great thanks to Ambassador Tai, for what I thought was a very good speech. I've been looking at the speech. We knew that while she's in Geneva giving a speech, I would be in Washington attending the IMF and World Bank meetings representing the WTO. And I think her speech was a quite a positive speech coming from the USTR. And I do not think she's wrong in alluding to all of us coming together for shared solutions to our problems. This is beyond rhetoric. When we think that we are all here and there are certain problems no one country can actually solve on its own. You know, I referred earlier to problems of the global commons.
Right.
If we don't come together to solve it, it will threaten our economic security, that of the United States, rich countries as well as poor countries. So it's in our collective interest to really come together to solve this problem of the pandemic, to solve the problem of climate change that is between us, and to see, in particular with respect to climate change, I think trade liberalization is still a good instrument. If we think of environmental goods and services and how we can make this circulate around the world. But let me also say one thing, Adam. You know, there's a lot of rhetoric on geopolitical tensions, let's say between China and the US, between Europe and China. But when you look at the trade data, what is actually happening on the ground belies the hot rhetoric that we hear. We see trade between China and Europe at peaks. Very, very robust trade. And the US-China trade is reaching the same levels. So consumers and businesses are saying one thing. And maybe politicians have the rhetoric that is saying something else. So let's not get carried away. I'm not saying the geopolitical tensions are not there and that they don't matter and that people do not misuse trade. I just, at the IMF committee meeting, pointed out to finance ministers that, look, sometimes problems that arise from macroeconomic imbalances are solved using trade remedies, which are inappropriate. So we can really kind of know that the tensions are there. But all I'm trying to say is we shouldn't overstate the issue because what's actually happening on the ground may be a little different.
Thank you so much for that, Director General. In your speech, you made the very powerful passage about the three largest economic entities not ignoring strategic cooperation, even if they wish to have strategic competition. And I think that was very powerful. I realize we are coming up on your departure time, so I'm afraid I'm going to ask the sort of toughest question last. Whether it's the WTO or the WHO or the World Bank or the IMF or other international organizations, we see recurrently the problem of the largest members or the most powerful members or the richest members opting out of things that, or misbehaving in ways that smaller or less rich members can't get away with. We're in a situation where most people, including Peterson analyses, would suggest that both the US and the People's Republic of China are really out of compliance with WTO rules on a large number of issues. What, in general terms, can the WTO do, like the other organizations, to deal with large members who are not living up to their obligations? Is the monitoring function key? Is dispute settlement key? Is it diplomacy? How do you cope?
Thank you, Adam. That's indeed a tough question. And, you know, you alluded, this is when we talk about WTO reform and the strengthening of our key monitoring function and transparency. This is what we're talking about. You know, there are members who don't notify just because they don't have the capacity, like the poorer countries. And of course, you can support them with capacity building to be able to do so. There are others who have the capacity but don't notify. What we are seeking is more transparency in this and strengthening our monitoring function to be able to, you know, detect these things, to be able to talk to members, to have them comply. What I normally say to members, the rich ones, is you've benefited from this system. It is undoubtedly true that, you know, democracies, the US, Europe, they've benefited from the multilateral trading system and the WTO rules that underpin it. So has China. This system has helped lift billions out of, or a billion people out of poverty.
Yep.
And if we want it to survive and benefit all of us again, we need to stick by the rules and we need to be transparent about what we are not doing right. It sets a good example for the poor countries. You can't be asking poor countries to comply when you yourself, if you're a well-off country, is not doing the same. So I think a lot of in committees, we've got these committees that look at this issue. So strengthening committee work where members look at each other's compliance, giving us more tools to strengthen our monitoring function, and bringing this transparency, shedding light on what is happening or not happening. I think that can help. That's what we are talking about, more transparency so that the rules of the game, it can be made clear who is obeying and who is not obeying them. When you shine a light on things, it really helps.
Thank you so much. You shined a light for us today at the Peterson Institute. I am grateful, and our virtual audience around the world is grateful for your leadership, Dr. Ngozi. We wish you every success with your vision for the ministerial and for the WTO going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, and I really want to commend you on the work of the Peterson Institute. It's very helpful to us to have this intellectual support, and I hope you'll continue to work with us and help us think through some of the very difficult problems we confront.
We're proud to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Dr. Ngozi, the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Thank you.